You're watching Euronews tonight. I'm Rome Zaidi, and these are the headlines this hour. Russian troops are advancing on the Ukrainian capital Kiev as the government calls on people to defend the city. President Zelensky appeals for more help for his country.
Demand from your governments that Ukraine gets greater help, greater financial, greater military help. Because this help is the help to you, to Europe.
We'll take a closer look at how the situation is unfolding, both in Kiev and across Ukraine.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's willing to send a delegation to Minsk for negotiations, but only if Ukraine demilitarizes. As EU foreign ministers thrash out a third round of sanctions against Russia, NATO leaders meet to discuss the alliance's next steps. Support for Ukraine swirls across the globe. Protesters take to the streets and even in Russian cities despite the threat of detention. Welcome to the programme. The battle for Kiev is underway as Ukraine continues its fight for survival on the second day of Russia's military invasion. After taking the Chernobyl exclusion zone to the north on Thursday, Russian forces have swept down towards the capital. Fierce street-to-street firefights have erupted in the city as Ukrainian defenders try to repel the attack. Now, across the country, Russia has mounted further military operations in an effort to take other major urban areas. Ukrainian civilian casualties continue to grow. President Volodymyr Zelensky remains in Kiev and has pleaded with the West for more help.
When the bombs fall on Kiev, it happens in Europe, not just Ukraine. When the rockets kill our people, it's the death of all Europeans. Demand more protection for Europe, more protection for Ukraine as part of the democratic world. While the government institutions in Europe are taking their time with really strong decisions, every European in their capital can already come to our embassy and offer their help. Demand from your governments that Ukraine gets greater help, greater financial, greater military help. Because this help is the help to you, to Europe.
The Kremlin says it's analysing a request by the Ukrainian president to hold talks. Ukraine's leader says he would be willing to discuss a non-aligned status for his country, preventing Kiev from joining NATO. However, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has called on Ukraine's armed forces to overthrow the current regime. Putin says the country is being held hostage by a gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis.
Once again, I appeal to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Do not allow neo-Nazis and Bandera to use your children, your wives and elderly as human shields. Take power into your own hands. It seems that it will be easier for us to come to an agreement than it will be to come to an agreement with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kiev and took the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
Well, for more on the situation around the Ukrainian capital, let's head over to our social media correspondent, Matthew Holroyd. Matthew?
The mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has said that the city is entering a defensive situation, as across the Ukrainian capital, explosions and gunshots can still be heard. Now, Ukrainian authorities have urged residents in the city to help the military in any way they can. They're offering out weapons very freely, but they're also encouraging people to report any suspicious activity amid reports of pro-Russian saboteurs, as well as encouraging citizens to make Molotov cocktails to potentially use against Russian forces. Now, this is the situation around Kiev. We already know that here to the northwest, Russian military forces had said they had taken control of the Hostomel airport, located around 7 kilometers away from Kiev. They said that 200 military personnel from Ukraine were killed in that report, but of course those claims are still to be verified. On top of this, we know that Russian forces are also approaching Kiev on the siege on the capital from both the west and also from the east. But it is inside the city that Russian tanks have already been spotted, here in the northern district of Obolon, very far away from where you have the government offices and the presidential region of Kiev. But let me show you some images that you'll have seen on social media of those Russian tanks in that Obolon district. In one of these shocking videos, it appears that a tank has been running into and run over a vehicle in which an elderly man was in. That man miraculously escaped from the vehicle. But of course, when it comes to both Kiev and across the whole of Ukraine, the true number of the casualties is still difficult to verify. As you can see, fighting has been intense across the country once again today, including in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, where there's been yet again intense shelling. Now, Russia said it has destroyed dozens of Ukrainian military vehicles as well as military infrastructure and sites. But on top of this, Ukraine's defense ministry has said that more than 1,000 Russian soldiers have so far been killed and that dozens of Russian aircraft and military vehicles have also been destroyed. It's important to stress that claims from both sides are difficult to verify during this war and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But Mariam, experts say that while in 2014, when Crimea was annexed and pro-Russian separatists began fighting in eastern Ukraine, the military in Ukraine was not as prepared as they are now. But still, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, there are reports that Russian vehicles and indeed personnel still outnumber Ukraine by more than 3 to 1.
Matthew, thanks for that overview. Thank you so much. Now, on the second day of fighting in Ukraine, residents in Kiev are bracing themselves for the arrival of Russian tanks in the capital. Well, to give us the update as they happen, we're now joined by Valerie Gourier, who is on the ground in Kiev for us. Valerie, good to see you. Thanks for joining us, of course. Now, we've seen videos circulating on social media, families sleeping in metro stations for shelter. What's the mood amongst people in Kiev today?
Well, indeed, there have been quite a few people who spent the night last night in shelters and in the metro stations upon the advice of the authorities. And today I met them again, well, some of them who were telling me that they were ready to go back and sleep in the subway, as they considered it the safest place, safer than their homes, sometimes high up, you know, in apartment buildings and without shelters. So they are obviously bracing for what they expect to be an invasion very soon. Many people have been talking of a possible incursion even tonight. There have been no real signs of this yet inside in the city center, although here now we do hear the sound of sirens. There were quite a few impressing ones about half an hour ago, and that's, you know, that recurs every 2 hours or so. But they do feel that this is happening soon. So there is fear, there is anxiety, but at the same time, what people have told me today is that they found a sort of a new modus vivendi in the underground. There's a whole different life under there. People are meeting new people, they're talking, they're supporting and comforting each other, encouraging each other, and you know, it's kind of what they were telling me is that they also lifted their spirit, because it's true that in the city center it's very gloomy, it's very quiet. I mean, the sun was shining today compared to yesterday, which was a bit of an improvement, but still, I mean, the atmosphere is extremely gloomy, extremely eerie. There's, you know, a feeling of expectation of something terrible that might happen very soon. So they were telling me that all this they could find some comfort when meeting each other in the subway. Here in the streets, you know, shops are closed. They were closed from 5, and when I say shops, that's, you know, we're smack in the center near Maidan, in front of Maidan Square, and there was one small supermarket open this afternoon. I couldn't go there. I was working, so it was locked at 5. Kiev, and everybody was looking for food or carrying bags of, goods around and scurrying home. So, yeah, the atmosphere is strangely both quiet and completely unsettling.
Okay, Valigori, thank you so much for painting us that picture of the situation on the ground in Kiev. And of course, as always, do stay safe. Well, for more on the situation in the capital, Kiev, we are now joined by Sasha, who is also in Kiev and is currently sheltering for safety. Sasha, thanks, of course, for being on the line with us, especially given the situation that you're in. Now, we're hearing that President Zelensky has, of course, used all of these broadcasts we're seeing today to appeal to foreign governments and to Putin himself. But what has he been saying to the Ukrainian people?
Well, President Zelensky has been trying to address the nation as regularly as it is possible, as he promised, and as he has been doing since the war started here more than 24 hours ago already. He asked people to stay put. There is not much to say except this: to stay calm, to stay put, to seek shelter, to go to the underground metro station whenever this is possible. And I've heard my colleague Valery Gorya just now reporting on those people staying there, the stories that are as heartwarming as they are heartbreaking, really. And he also asked people to come and join to help Ukraine to defend itself. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky says that was not Ukraine that has chosen the path of war. Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine wants a diplomatic solution. And he said again and again to the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, that the talks, that some negotiations, some sort of dialogue will still have to happen, because this cannot go on forever. And some kind of... The question now, of course, is in what shape, how will that happen? This is something that we don't know for the moment.
Now, Sasha, you bring up there this idea that the president is calling on people to support Ukraine. We've also been hearing that adult men between 18 and 60 years old who have any sort of military training, well, they're actually being banned from actually leaving Ukraine. What more can you tell us about that?
Certainly, this is part of the martial law that was announced by Volodymyr Zelensky. A man between 18 years old and 60 years old cannot leave the territory of Ukraine. They cannot cross the borders. They have to stay here and they have to be mobilized. They have to come. But I tell you this, many men, even before this was announced, they did go and volunteer to sign up, to go and protect, to go to different offices. We've seen the pictures today from the cities all across Ukraine, not just in the capital, of people, of men queuing up. They're ready to go there and to volunteer. The authorities, of course, tried to help that out. They said you don't need much. If you're not prepared, you don't have any training in the past, still come over. You just need your passport and that would be enough. Whoever is ready to stand up now and to protect Ukraine, to defend Ukraine from what's been happening, from this offensive, from these attacks, is welcome to do so. And Ukrainian authorities have really simplified all the requirements and all the rules for that.
Okay, Sasha Vakalina, thank you so much for updating us on the situation in Kiev. And of course, just like with Valerie, please do stay safe for us. Thank you. Now, EU foreign ministers have met in Brussels to discuss another raft of sanctions for Russia. Now, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Thursday, the bloc passed punitive measures against Moscow. The sanctions target Russia's energy, financial and aviation industries. The EU's foreign affairs minister, Joseph Borrell, says the new round of sanctions will be the harshest yet. Well, let's now cross over to Shona Murray in Brussels for more on that. Shona, okay, so in Brussels, they've been discussing another tranche of sanctions. What's on the list? Has the SWIFT banking system entered that list also?
Yes, I think this morning, even though this last night's agreement was the greatest tranche of sanctions ever from the European Union to any country, not just Russia, there was a feeling that some major elements were left out, some major elements that could be very damaging to the Russian economy, which is the whole point of these sanctions. And SWIFT, the financial transaction system, was part of that. There was a huge reluctance from some member states to do that, Germany, Italy and some other countries, particularly because they use that system to pay for Russian gas. And it would be damaging to European countries. But it seems now during this meeting, SWIFT is back on the table. I caught up with Simon Coveney, who's the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister, just before we went into that meeting, and I asked him about that. I also asked him when he confirmed that Vladimir Putin and his Foreign Secretary, Sergei Lavrov, would also be sanctioned. But here's what he said about SWIFT specifically.
I think that many countries want to go beyond what's being agreed today, including Ireland. There's a lot of talk about the SWIFT system in terms of money transfers and banking, and that should be part of this package. We agree with that. The Taoiseach made the case for that last night, and I understand that there is already a third package of sanctions that includes the SWIFT system, which may well be passed in the next few days.
The Irish Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney, saying that Ireland was behind removing Russia from the SWIFT transaction system, but that during this Foreign Affairs meeting today, which is ongoing, there seems to be a consensus building around that as well. Mariam?
Now, Shona, Joseph Borrell, he's been telling Ukraine today that it's not alone. We've seen the EU come out with its financial sanctions, but the Ukrainian president, he wants the EU to do more. So will the EU go further?
Well, it is a key question. I think one of the reasons why you have this third tranche of sanctions is because President Zelensky addressed EU leaders last night and said he didn't know when the next time he'd speak to them. He's obviously a man who's in a seriously dangerous position. You know, as he said himself, as the Americans have said and told him, they have intelligence that there is a hit out for him. He's number one on a list to be killed by the Russian regime. So obviously he needs more help. Joseph Borrell made the point that the EU is doing everything it can. It's not a military organisation. Tonight at the UN Security Council, there's a resolution tabled by France condemning Russia. Now, obviously, it'll be breached by Russia, who's a permanent member, but it'll be moved on to the General Assembly then. And I think what's important at this point is to know where the world stands on this armed conflict, this invasion on Ukraine, not just Europe and the US and Canada and Australia, but the rest of the world. And I think that's what the EU is trying to do, garner support. Mariam?
All right, well, Shona, thank you for updating us on what those new EU sanctions could possibly be. Thank you so much. OK, well, staying in Brussels, NATO is holding a special leaders' summit to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The move followed calls from Poland to increase NATO's forces in the east. Together with Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, Poland have requested this emergency meeting to discuss Article 4, which covers the security of any parties of the alliance that is threatened. Well, for more on that special NATO Leaders Summit, we stay with Brussels and to Effie Kutsakosta. Effie, good to see you. So a summit call to allay Eastern allies' security concerns. What guarantees or extra support is NATO providing?
Exactly, Mariam. The NATO leaders, together, as you said, with Sweden and Finland, which are not members of the alliance, and the heads of the EU Council and EU Commission are meeting to discuss, actually, the plans to send more troops to the eastern flank of the alliance. What we know so far, because we don't have any details about, the numbers exactly and the places that these troops or this equipment will go, we already know that the United States, for example, they already ordered to send more fighter jets or attack aircrafts to the Baltics, to Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, while they said that they will send thousands of troops to Germany, Poland and Romania. Of course, as you can imagine, there is a lot of discussion about how they will reshape their posture as everything is changing. Actually, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said it in every tone that we woke up in a new reality, especially now that Russia invaded Ukraine. And if you see, Mariam, in the statement issued just a few minutes ago, the heads of NATO states, all the 30 of them, want to show how united they are in condemning this attack, this invasion that described as brutal, unprovoked, wholly unprovoked and unjustified. And of course, they call on Putin to come back, to turn back from this path of aggression that he took. And of course, they describe the next steps. We're waiting for the press conference to start shortly with Jens Stoltenberg to see if we can find out more details about the new military defensive plans of the alliance.
Now, Effie, Ukraine's President Zelensky, well, he's, talked a lot today about Ukraine being alone. So he definitely wants more help from Western allies, from NATO. Yet it seems that NATO, of course, is adamant that it's not going to commit these boots on the ground.
Exactly, Mariam. It's something that we already knew. Ukraine is not a member of NATO alliance. Of course, NATO said that they will help, they will support Ukraine in any other means, with advice, with training missions, and with diplomatic means, and of course by defending the territory of NATO. President Zelensky asked again to become a member of NATO, and he said that of course all of the people were quite afraid to reply yes. And we know that there is no, of course, appetite. There was not even before the invasion any appetite of Ukraine's joining NATO, and this was also said in any tone also towards Russia. But of course the plans of Russia were different. But of course we know that still NATO and the United States President Joe Biden already said it yesterday that he doesn't want to fight Russia. He doesn't want to get involved militarily, and not any other state of NATO wants to get involved militarily in this war. But of course, they will do everything they can to defend NATO's territory and to reassure allies. Mariam.
Okay, Effie Kutsukosto, thank you so much for updating us on the latest from NATO. Thank you so much. Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed for more Western military help and tougher sanctions on Russia, warning that the current action isn't enough. Well, on Thursday, US President Joe Biden said that he's sending an additional 7,000 troops to Europe, in addition to 5,000 already deployed there. However, he's reiterated that these were to defend and reassure NATO members in Eastern Europe and not to engage in a conflict with Russia and in Ukraine. Well, let's cross to Washington, D.C. and speak to Euronews reporter Ray Suarez. Ray, so the U.S. has offered aid to Ukraine and sanctions on Russia, but President Zelensky is saying today, really, that Ukraine has been left alone. So will Washington go further with its aid, you think?
Well, with each new escalation on the Russian side of the ledger, there has been an escalation on the Washington side, short of sending troops into Ukraine itself. The Biden administration has been very clear from the very beginning, both in its councils with European allies and its announcements to the world, and domestically, here talking to the American people, that U.S. troops will not be fighting in Eastern Europe as this crisis continues. Biden has never backed away from that, never even posited what a possibility might be that could get American troops involved. And that doesn't look likely to change, even if new weapons might be sent to the Ukrainian military itself. Mariam?
But is there a situation where that could change? I know that you said it won't, but NATO says it's going to deploy more troops to Eastern Europe. So, and we know, of course, that the US is sending more troops as well, but obviously no troops on the ground in Ukraine. But is there any possible situation where that could change, Ray?
The United States military is even reluctant to discuss something like a no-fly zone, which would involve having either U.S. or NATO aircraft over Ukrainian airspace to defend it at this point. The whole history of the post-World War II world, especially in Europe, involved avoiding at all costs a military confrontation between two nuclear-armed powers. This would put the United States directly in confrontation with Russia. And this would be, turning back the doctrine of the last 75 years and perceived here in Washington as incredibly risky. NATO's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, an elite force, specially equipped, specially trained, drawn from multiple NATO nations, is about to head to Eastern Europe, showing a serious upgrading of the kind of commitment NATO is making to defending its eastern flank. But there seems to be unanimity around not getting involved directly on the ground in Ukraine with the possibility of firing in anger at any Russian soldier.
There definitely does seem to be that. But, Ray, what about Americans? What do they want their president to do? Do they want Joe Biden to give Ukraine more support, especially in this very dire hour?
Ukraine has been an issue of controversy over the last several presidential administrations, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, with choruses of critics on both sides saying, you're not doing enough to help Ukraine, and you're doing too much to help Ukraine. This will only provoke Russia. This is far afield from American interests, and no American risks should be taken in Ukraine. So presidents, 3 of them in a row now, have gotten an earful about what to do. Americans themselves have not been particularly involved on this issue. We've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, economic problems, and high-volume domestic political conflict. Ukraine has not been front and center here in United States political debates. That may very well change now that Ukraine coverage is dominating American news services, and when an American turns on the radio, turns on TV, or signs on to the web to surf news sites, what you see is destroyed apartment buildings, fleeing people, frightened civilians, things blowing up in the distance. This will center American opinion, and in the next several days, in advance of the State of the Union address, one of the most important speeches President Biden will give during this year, it'll be interesting to track how American public opinion will be changing on this issue. But up until now, even as the crisis escalated in Eastern Europe, even as the volume of the back and forth between Russia, Europe, and the United States increased, Americans were not highly engaged on the Ukraine issue.
OK, Ray Suarez, thank you for that update from DC. Thank you so much. OK, well, let's now get a view from Russia. We can speak to Sergei Utkin, the head of Strategic Assessment Section, Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Thank you so much for being on Euronews tonight. Now, the pictures that we've seen already, from this invasion by Russian people leaving, injured, killed, they really can't be any winners in this, can there?
Yes, indeed. I don't see any good scenarios here. I think it's a great catastrophe for Russia and Ukraine, what's happening. And the big question is where this whole terrible war can go now, how long it will last, if it ends somehow with negotiations very soon, which is unlikely, to be frank. Then you could probably sell it to the people as something that was necessary to do, which is what Putin is saying currently. But if it lasts for a long time, this will be a disaster, and probably this will be impossible to cover with any propaganda campaign.
Well, you bring up President Putin now. He has been saying today that he's open to dialogue. But what do you see as his real aim in all of this?
Well, if we listen to him carefully, we'll see that he's basically speaking about demilitarization of Ukraine and what one could call dismemberment of Ukraine, creation of several entities. Some of them might choose a way of align with Russia. Some would be probably more distant. It all sounds like a storyline from a fiction novel, but the negative consequences that Russia is getting because of this terrible move are unprecedented, and that means that also gains, at least in Putin's terms, also have to be unprecedented to justify that. Whether this will also be seen as a gain by the population, it will depend on the length and brutality of the campaign. The harder it will go, the harder it will be to sell it to the people.
And so do you think that Western powers should perhaps be worried that they should be doing more, given that what we understand, the kind of country that President Putin perhaps wants to turn Ukraine into?
Well, I think you already have quite some Western reaction, a number of very serious sanctions that will have an impact. And overall, I just don't see how this terrible campaign can end as a Russian success. So you can leave even the sanctions alone and just think of what Russia would do in Ukraine to control the territory or to create kind of government that would be better from the point of view of the Russian authorities. All that is super complicated, and I don't see how this can be done smoothly and successfully.
But what if Putin was allowed what if Putin was allowed to go forward and to allow this to make a regime change in Ukraine? What then should the West be saying or doing?
Well, in the West, you have enough clever people who look into all sorts of instruments they have. The biggest problem is, of course, that if there is a very big determination on the part of the Russian government to just push for this military solution, it will be practically impossible to stop it until it runs its course. So first you'll have the devastating consequences of this war, and only then we'll see what can be made out of that. Can you have any kind of negotiations also between Russia and the West? At this point, all the previously existing negotiations formats are practically destroyed, and new are not yet created, and it's impossible to create them right in the middle of this warfare.
OK, Sergei Utikin, Head of Strategic Assessment Section at Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations, we thank you so much for being on the programme. Thank you so much. Well, we will now take a short break, but do stay with us on Euronews Tonight for more analysis on the Ukraine crisis.